So now we're going to get into what happened to the tribe that tried to fight. And this one's going to be a little bit, probably closer to 10 minutes. And so that gold greed continued. Again, in western Idaho with the Nez Perce, very little gold was found, even though the Nez Perce were pushed off their land. Next, settlers and miners start to travel across the Great Plains and basically look for gold or look for different paths west. A number of them took something called the Bozeman Trail. The Bozeman Trail was a settler's trail, which went from Fort Laramie, Wyoming, into Montana. It was a pretty accessible trail, traveled through the Rockies pretty well. You didn't have to go through many scary areas, no Donner Party area, anything like that. Problem with the trail is it crossed through sacred Sioux hunting grounds. And the Sioux believed their hunting grounds to be kind of a religious area and didn't believe that others should be allowed to trespass. Imagine like someone basically walking through a church service, yelling and screaming and thinking what they were doing was okay. The Sioux, led by a number of different leaders, Red Cloud and Sitting Bull were their political leaders, and Crazy Horse and Rain in the Face were basically their war chiefs or their war generals, protest against this use. And by protest, I mean they started picking off settlers as they started going through the area. Obviously, they warned that they would fight to save their hunting grounds if necessary. Now, in 1865, Red Cloud's warriors, Red Cloud used Crazy Horse as his war chief, attacked settlers along the trail. The U.S. Army responded by building defense posts, or basically little forts along the trail that would allow the settlers to stop in different safe areas and allow different Army officials to be there along the way. In response, we have another massacre. Now, the difference this time is it's actually the Native Americans leading the massacre against the U.S. Army. Now, what happens is this guy named Fetterman basically leads a supply caravan along that trail. All the forts needed supplies. And so once a month, a supply caravan would go along and make sure that there was food, blankets, things like that they needed. They were ambushed by Red Cloud's warriors. Actually, what happens is one Native American warrior jumps down onto the trail and shoots an arrow over the top of the wagon train, missing everything, lets out a war cry, and then runs up into the woods. Stupidly, Fetterman orders himself and all 82 of his men into the woods to chase after this one warrior. There were about 600 warriors hidden in the woods, and Fetterman and his men were massacred. Not only were they killed, they were dismembered and their body parts were piled up in the middle of the trail. Settlers obviously stopped taking the trail because they're terrified of what might happen to them. Even John Bozeman himself was decapitated and his head was hung from a tree to show white people that the trail was unsafe. The odd part about this is right after all this happened, the Sioux kind of gave up and decided to move to a reservation. I mean, they were winning, but they realized that they probably couldn't win in the long run. So the Sioux still had problems with the whites. They agreed to go to a new reservation in the Dakotas and actually an area we know as the Badlands. But then the Northern Pacific Railroad decided they wanted to build a railroad through their reservation land. Obviously, a war breaks out. The Sioux, again, are led by those guys I talked about in the last slide, in particularly Crazy Horse's, their general. Crazy Horse was seen as this like invincible character. White people didn't believe they could kill him. They basically described him to their children as being like the boogeyman. The American forces in the West were led by a man named George Armstrong Custer. He was a lieutenant colonel. Custer had kind of a unique style for fighting against Native American tribes. He believed in waiting until the warriors were gone and then kidnapping the women and children and using them as leverage to make the warriors give up. Custer is also known for his vanity. He was one of the most photographed Americans in history, leading up to kind of the modern age of the Kardashians and people like that. Now, Custer was concerned about his own fame and glory, so he often led his men into really dangerous situations. He had been relatively successful up until this point in his fights against Native Americans, but obviously this is going to be the situation where things go wrong. Crow Scouts, an enemy tribe to the Sioux, told Custer not to go near the Little Bighorn River. They thought that the village had too many teepees and probably had too many people. Custer led 264 men and eventually some reserves in number of about 500 to where he had about 700 men, and he attacked what he believed to be a small Sioux camp. In a very small amount of time, what they found was the Crazy Horse had about 4,000 Sioux warriors along with some Northern Cheyenne soldiers, bringing the Native American total to almost 7,000. The battle did not last long. The plan was made by Sitting Bull, the chief and shaman of the Lakota Sioux. He hated the whites intensely, believed that they were liars. He said they spoke with forked tongues and were snakes. And so when he set up the battle plan, he basically set up a plan that said that no whites would come out alive. As soon as Custer and his men rode in, they were surrounded by Crazy Horse, and the battle wasn't much of a battle at all. All of the American soldiers, including Custer, were killed. The information that we have about the battle actually came from mostly the Sioux perspective on the battle, and so we know very little about the American strategies and what they tried to do in the fight. Crazy Horse becomes this legendary, mysterious character that Americans learn to fear, but in reality what happened is that major win that the Sioux had also became this major defeat, because after this, the American army sought them out as like the number one enemy. For about 14 months, the Sioux were the attack point of the American army. They chased them and chased them and chased them. But then finally what happens is it's something called the Ghost Dance. At a place called Wounded Knee, we have the end to Indian independence. This is considered to be the last battle of the Indian War. It happened in 1889. The tribes were doing a religious ceremony called the Ghost Dance. It's actually a celebration of their tribal strength, but they also knew that their time as independent nations were probably coming towards an end. The ceremony is often called the Wovoka or the Ghost Dance. Again, the specifics of the ceremony aren't really that important to you guys, but it was an extremely important ceremony to the Sioux. It wasn't a war dance, but the settlers in the area felt threatened by the number of Native Americans that were together, and so they called in the army. The army decided, let's just fire this all out. The army decided that this would be a good opportunity for them to arrest the Sioux leaders who were in charge at the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. During the arrest, a shot rang out. No one knows to this day exactly who shot, but the army felt threatened and opened fire on the people having the Ghost Dance. The Sioux tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed by the pure numbers and the fact that the army was armed at the time. 290 Sioux women and children were killed during the Ghost Dance. At this point, the Sioux decide that they can't fight anymore and agree to go and live on reservations. The different groups of the Sioux are split up among Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. This really kind of signals the end of Indian independence. Really, kind of the big things on this slide are that some white people start to learn about what happened and start to write books, which increases people's awareness of what's happening. And a number of whites on the east part of the country asked for better treatment of the Native American tribes. Congress responded by passing the Dawes Severalty Act. The Dawes Severalty Act took those reservation lands and broke them up into individual family units. Told the Native Americans that if they wanted to farm that land and didn't sell it, they could become citizens and have the right to vote within 25 years. The government probably thought they were doing a good thing, when in reality, in the end, it ended up being a chance to try to Americanize them. They forced the Native Americans to be farmers, to build regular houses, to send their kids to schools to learn English, and basically force them into more of a white way of life towards pushing them to this citizenship. Again, they were the tribe that tried to fight the Sioux. So we talked about a tribe that tried to give up, a tribe that tried to run, and a tribe that tried to fight. And all three, unfortunately, ended up the same way.